even committed by the very government that's supposed to protect us from persecution. Sunday night at 9 on Afterwards, part of Book TV this weekend on C-SPAN 2.
Earlier this year, Southern Methodist University hosted a conversation with every director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Established in 2001 by President George W. Bush, the office is tasked with helping faith-based and community organizations provide federally funded social services. The symposium explored the importance of the office and its implications for church-state relations. It's just under 2 hours.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we at SMU and the Center for Presidential History are honored to have you here with us this evening. And I hope I can speak for all of us when I say that it is an honor to have our 5 guests and panelists with us today. These 5 people have served our country well. They have led the charge in finding fair, constitutional, efficient, and effective ways for our national government to assist and partner with faith-based and neighborhood organizations in our midst, which are doing great social good. In short, they have invested personally in making our country a better place to live in. And for the first time, we have the opportunity to hear from all of them from the same stage. In January 2001, President Bush used his first executive orders to establish the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. This central office would oversee faith-based and community initiatives within various departments of the government, including the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, and several more in the coming years. For years, President Bush and his advisors believed that small, faith-based, and community organizations had been at an unfair disadvantage, competing on an unlevel playing field when it came to qualifying for and accessing and receiving federal funding. And although they were serving America's communities in many ways, they did not have the resources, information, or connections to pursue federal funding that larger, more prominent organizations had. In some instances, they found faith-based organizations were finding themselves at a disadvantage in applying for funding, specifically because they were faith-based. The White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives was established in order to address these issues, difficulties, and inequities. Each of our panelists has served or is serving as the director of this very office. Now, I encourage you to take a good look at your programs that you picked up on the way in, because you will see that they are all eminently, incredibly qualified, experienced, and hardworking people. But for now, please allow me to briefly introduce all of our distinguished guests. Our first guest, John DiUlio, served as the first director of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives in 2001. He is currently Frederick Fox Leadership Professor of Politics, Religion, and Civil Society, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and is involved in multiple organizations aimed at aiding our nation's communities in his hometown of Philadelphia. After Dr. DiUlio left office, President Bush appointed our second guest, Jim Toohey, as the new director. He served there from 2002 to 2006 and is now in his 3rd year as president of Ave Maria University in Southwest Florida. Our third guest, Jay Hine, served as director of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives from 2006 to 2008. Since 2008, Mr. Hine has served as Distinguished Senior Fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion and as president of the Sagamore Institute, an international public policy research firm. When President Obama came into office in 2009, he oversaw a revamping of this White House office, including renaming it the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. He appointed as its new director our fourth guest, Joshua Dubois. Dubois recently left his office after serving from 2009 to early 2013 in order to author a new book, become a weekly columnist for the Daily Beast, and to start Values Partnerships, a consulting firm aimed at helping companies and nonprofits partner with the faith community to solve community problems. Finally, I would like to introduce our fifth guest, Melissa Rogers, the current executive director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Before assuming her White House post in March of this year, Rogers served in senior positions at the Center for Religion and Public Affairs at Wake Forest University Divinity School, the Brookings Institution, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, and as General Counsel for the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Again, I encourage you to take a look at each of their bios on your program. These are some truly remarkable people. And tonight we have the opportunity to hear from all 5 of these experts and civil servants. Allow me to explain how we will proceed from this point on. I've asked each of our panelists to share for 10 to 15 minutes about their experiences, their successes and difficulties, their views on the role of the White House in matters of faith and the public square. After each has had an opportunity to speak, I will lead a discussion amongst our panelists about some of the most important issues they have raised. And finally, at the end, we will open up the floor for you to ask questions of our guests. It takes very little faith to believe that I have spoken enough for now. Panelists, we are eager to hear about your experiences and your thoughts on the role of the White House in matters of faith and the public square. So audience, please join me in welcoming our first panelist, the first director of the now Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, Dr. John DiUlio.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's really an extraordinary privilege and pleasure to be here with you. I want to thank the Center for Presidential History here at SMU, and I want to thank Brian and the other leaders of the center for bringing us all together. It's a real personal treat to be here with my friends and colleagues, Jim, Jay, Joshua, and Melissa. Melissa being not only the first woman to direct the office, but the first person whose first name does not begin with J. Each of my colleagues here served with incredible distinction. And I say that, this is not the kind of thing you just come and say, when you're all together and you got to be nice. I mean it from the heart. Jim succeeded a crazy fat man from Philadelphia and then succeeded in institutionalizing the office under far from easy circumstances and was able to forge faith-based and community initiatives aplenty. Jay sustained that office and worked creatively to grow the effort even as the sands drained from the second term hourglass. And if you don't believe it, just wait for this book that's coming out, Quiet Revolution, in January. It tells the story. Joshua transitioned the office under a new president of a different party and engaged the widest spectrum of leaders of all faiths and of no faith and established centers in every cabinet agency and other federal units as well. Presidential Devotionals is out too, isn't it? Yes, sir. I'm a book salesman, as you can tell. I'm selling their books. I'm on commission too, by the way, with these shown. And last but not least, Melissa, whose history with the office predates her own directorship, having served from her perch at Brookings as a key confidant and friend to both the first Bush and the first Obama so-called faith czars. And she has already begun to develop so many exciting new faith-based and neighborhood partnerships and initiatives. So God bless each of them, and God bless President George W. Bush, and God bless President Barack Obama. Now, I've been teaching at Ivy League universities for more than 30 years, so I qualify as having the key value of an Ivy League professor, which means I can speak for 5 minutes or 2 hours on any subject with no essential change in content. So before you hear from my betters on this panel, however, let me inflict 10 or 12 minutes or so of my thoughts about our topic for this evening, faith, the White House, and the public square, and I'll offer 4 sets of points. The first point I would make is that today, faith-based is not only a term associated with a White House office that's soon to be 14 years old. Faith-based, more importantly, is a permanent part of the public discourse about religion, policy, and civic life. In the half dozen or so years that preceded the establishment of the White House office, a small but intellectually and ideologically and religiously diverse cadre of policy wonks and opinion leaders and public officials came together. And what happened was that we trumpeted a fact that was hiding pretty much in plain view. Namely, the fact that America's urban churches and synagogues and mosques and other houses of worship, plus its large national organizations like Catholic Charities and Salvation Army and others, and most of all, at least from where I sat, its small street-level ministries concentrated in the nation's poorest places. All of these functioned as sacred places that served civic purposes. food pantries, daycare, drug and alcohol prevention or treatment, homeless shelters, after-school and summer education, youth violence reduction, welfare to work placement and job training, health care, prisoner reentry, and literally scores upon scores more. In many cities from coast to coast, these faith-based organizations were not just add-ons, but accounted for much or most of given types of social service delivery, either on their own or in partnerships with other groups or with public agencies. The vast majority of these sacred places served people of all faiths and of no faith. Most did not discriminate on religious grounds in mobilizing workers or volunteers, and their primary beneficiaries, at least in most urban areas, were children, youth, and young adults who were not themselves members or co-religionists. And while the larger, more professionalized and more secularized religious nonprofits were, for the most part, treated fairly in competition for government grants and contracts, smaller religious nonprofits, including community-serving ministries in inner-city neighborhoods, were often discriminated against, sometimes for innocent reasons, like Byzantine bureaucratic protocols, but also, in some not-so-innocent cases, out of outright hostility to religious people and places. President Clinton and First Lady Clinton were really, I would say, the first major fans, White House fans, of faith-based. The first federal faith-based center was established during the second Clinton term out of the Department of Housing and Urban Development under Secretary Andy Cuomo. But it really was in the 2000 presidential election that faith-based, as it were, went national to stay. Vice President Gore and Governor Bush had their respective favorite locutions on the subject, paramedics of civil society, armies of compassion, etc., but their respective messages, their core messages on faith-based, were much the same. I still think the best single sentence in this regard was the one that Governor Bush first delivered in his July 1999 Duty of Hope speech, the speech that launched his presidential campaign. Quote, "Government cannot be replaced by charities, but it should welcome them as partners, not resent them as rivals." Close quote. A new White House office, while respecting all settled church-state doctrines and limits, would build on the federal so-called charitable choice laws that had been enacted in the late 1990s, would welcome religious leaders into the White House, into the public square, into the public discourse and debate and dialogue, and it would promote faith-based and community initiatives and partnerships to expand mentoring for the children of prisoners and to achieve many, many other civic goals. Not everybody was thrilled with this approach. Orthodox secularists, mainly among Democratic Party elites, and Orthodox sectarians, mainly among Republican Party elites, did not like the bipartisan, centrist, level-the-playing-field approach. Still, each candidate, both Bush and Gore, persisted in embracing and in articulating this vision. And thereafter, so too did governors and mayors in each party. Although it has received relatively little attention, the White House office has its younger siblings in dozens of state governments and scores of mayor's offices all around the country. Second, today the empirical evidence on the existence, extent, and efficacy of faith-based organizations and programs is both deeper and wider than it was back in 2001 when the office was established. For instance, a forthcoming study by my University of Pennsylvania colleague, Dr. Ram Kannan, being conducted in concert with Partners for Sacred Places, the nation's leading national non-sectarian organization that tends to the historic preservation of older religious properties that are involved in community activities and purposes. Dr. Kannan's study will indicate that the civic replacement value of the average older urban congregation, that is, in effect, what it would cost taxpayers were these sacred places to stop supplying social services and serving civic purposes as they do, that this replacement value is, if anything, several times what it was estimated to be when the first generation of studies were completed. Faith-based organizations and programs have what he calls an halo effect with respect to economic development that goes even far beyond their social service delivery prowess. So stay tuned for those interesting academic findings. I know you can't wait. Third, in the courts of public opinion and the courts of law, alike, I would say, the core ideas and sentiments behind the White House office that began in 2001 are at least as widely embraced today and probably more widely embraced and accepted than before. For all the church-state controversies that have from time to time turned faith-based from a civic tonic into a civic toxin, nearly three-quarters of all Americans, including wide majorities of both Republicans and Democrats, believe in the civic value of sacred places, believe that most do a very good and cost-effective job at supplying vital social services, and support a level playing field for all religious nonprofits when it comes to government grants and administration. It's certainly true that in the past dozen years or so, we've witnessed a rise in the fraction of Americans that claim no religious affiliation, what the survey researchers have termed nuns, as in N-O-N-E-S's, not N-U-N-S's. When I first heard that 15% of Americans were nuns, I got very excited. I went to Catholic school, so I figured, wow, look out. But even many of these so-called nuns say they nonetheless see themselves as religious or spiritual and consider religion important in their own daily lives. Moreover, churches are now second only to the military in public trust and confidence, way ahead of public schools, newspapers, labor unions, big businesses, and of course, Congress. Over the last dozen years or so, as well, virtually all the major constitutional and other legal challenges to faith-based have resulted in rulings that either favor faith-based efforts or that challenge those that would treat faith-motivated citizens as second-class citizens. Alas, our nation's social and civic capital is inextricably bound up with its spiritual capital. That is a fact, and it's a fact warmly embraced by most Americans without regard to party, religion, demographic description, or socioeconomic status. That said, and still in all, the lives of future White House office directors will be no less interesting or surrounded by political conflicts and cross-currents than our respective tenures were, or in Melissa's case, still are. Hence my fourth and final points for you. To me, the soon-to-be 14-year-old White House office, in addition to all its actual, substantive, ongoing good works, should serve now and in the future as a symbolic reminder that deep as the divisions may go on church-state issues, whether in general or on particular issues like religious hiring rights, what unites us is always more important than what divides us. As my Jesuit friends like to preach, in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, in all things charity. Who among us, for instance, does not want to find ways for diverse faith-based organizations to partner with each other, with secular nonprofits, and with federal, state, or local government agencies to improve and expand the health and human services that go to America's elderly shut-ins, to the ever-growing numbers of senior citizens that in many regions and cities live alone or with only other elderly relatives or friends to tend to them or help them? Who does not want the same faith-based and neighborhood partnerships to improve and expand in relation to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's food and nutrition programs, to curb the spikes in childhood hunger that occur each summer when the free and reduced price meals that kids get during the school months are no longer so readily available? A bipartisan, centrist, problem-solving, community-anchored vision was behind the original case for faith-based. Now, I do not mean to say that by hearkening back to that vision, all our disagreements will melt away, nor do I mean to say that by rallying together to meet specific civic challenges like the two I just mentioned, we will have nothing about which to fuss, fight, or sue each other over. But I do mean to say that to focus exclusively on the disagreements while forgetting the past, present, or potential common grounds, to dispute without regard to what resolving the disputes might yield in the way of the common good, is the road to civic perdition. The White House office came into being and has persisted in part because people of diverse faiths and of no faith focused faithfully and together on the civic challenges that faith-based and neighborhood partnerships could help to meet, doing so with genuine compassion, looking for compassion in truth and action, and caring especially about the least, the last, and the lost of our society. Speaking to a group of Boston's inner-city clergy in 2005, Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton put it this way, and I quote, "But I ask you, who is more likely to go out onto a street to save some poor at-risk child than someone from the community, someone who believes in the divinity of every person, who sees God at work in the lives of even the most hopeless and left behind of our children? And that's why we need not to have a false division or debate about the role of faith-based institutions. We need to just do it and provide the support that is needed on an ongoing basis." Close quote. Albeit in different ways, Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama each embraced that vision, and albeit at different times and with different approaches, each of my friends and esteemed colleagues here tonight is to be credited with fighting the good fight and with defending and translating that vision into action. What a blessing each has been, and what an honor it is to be here this evening with them and with you all. So thank you, and God bless you.
Well, once again, I'm in the position of following John DiIulio, author, scholar, national expert on all things faith-based. Kind of reminds me of what the seventh husband of Elizabeth Taylor, who said on their wedding night to his new bride, "I think I know what to do, but I'm not sure how to make it interesting." So I'm going to... But as the longest-serving faith-based director, I'm going to give it a try. Properly understood, the faith-based initiative is about changing lives. It's about finding and funding the most effective programs, both with public and private resources, programs that help addicts recover, the youth turn to opportunity instead of gangs, the jobless find work, the homeless stable housing, children of prisoners, mentors, and re-entering prisoners jobs and housing so that they contribute to society instead of attacking it. And these problems are pressing today as they were when the faith-based initiative was launched, perhaps even more so. In fact, in the last 4 years, we've seen an increase in the number of people living in poverty, according to the Census Bureau, an increase of 6.67 million people. President Bush believes in America's armies of compassion and the transformative change of their programs. He also knew that too often government programs at the national, state, and local level discriminated against them. Government often communicated that if faith-based groups wanted to partner with them, they'd have to change their identity and, in effect, secularize. At the time of President Bush's election, the federal government was regularly forcing some groups to change their mission statements, to diversify their board of directors so that they weren't all of one faith, to take down the mezuzah at the door or the cross nearby, and even change their names if they wanted to play ball with the federal government. Ask the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty in New York, who was denied access to a grant because Jewish was in their name, or the Orange County Rescue Mission in Los Angeles. Ask Old North Church in Boston, who was denied a Save America's Treasure grant. Ask the Seattle Hebrew Academy after their earthquake when they were denied a FEMA grant to help rebuild their school. Ask the Salvation Army in Janesville, Wisconsin. All had been manhandled by government and the high priests of secular orthodoxy who were hostile to all things faith-based. And this, of course, this effort of these secularists begins, of course, with Protestants and other Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, an organization now known as Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, but an organization steeped in anti-Catholic bigotry. Religion and presidential politics have been entwined from our founding. From George Washington's inauguration, when he added to his oath the words, "So help me God," and actually bent over to kiss the Bible, to the very present day. Even Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Wall of Separation of Church and State, was 2 days after penning that phrase in his 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists, in a government building attending Sunday church services with U.S. government employees, the Marine Band, playing the church hymns. Franklin Roosevelt, in his speech during a time of war, spoke of the mercy that flows from the cross and you could go down throughout presidential history and find other analogs. So when President Bush, during his term in office, talked of faith and the power of faith-based organizations to change lives, he was squarely in line with presidential precedent. So why the uproar over his faith-based initiative? Why the cries that the wall separating church and state was under attack, that he was ushering in a theocracy, and that he was paying back his friends on the religious right? Well, by the end of his term, all of these charges proved to be groundless. First, the initiative was constitutional and succeeded in every single court challenge before it, including the Supreme Court of the United States case, Freedom from Religion Foundation versus Toohey, which became Freedom from Religion Foundation versus Hine, my successor, which was decided on standing grounds, but whose record showed that the White House conferences that we had conducted were in no way government-funded religious exercise. The University of Notre Dame's ACE program, which had been sued by the American Jewish Congress, won a unanimous reversal by the U.S. Circuit Court, and the real winners were the school kids being taught by these Notre Dame grads. The President's Equal Treatment Executive Order in December 2002 went unchallenged because it was fair and forthright. It leveled the playing field that Dr. DiIulio had so carefully analyzed in his very important work called Unlevel Playing Field that he produced while director of the White House Faith-Based Office. Second, there was the charge that a theocracy was coming to power and that government was being Christianized. And of course, this also proved bogus. The only evidence of divine intervention during the Bush presidency took place when that poor lawyer was hunting and survived being shot at point blank by Vice President Cheney. Third, the charge that the initiative was payback to the religious right and that grants were being funneled to the president's evangelical friends withered when the Associated Press was given by me a list of all the discretionary grants by federal agencies that had been awarded, billions of dollars in grants. And the reporter, Laura Meckler, couldn't find any evidence of grants being funneled to the religious right. There was no story. These attacks that adhered to the faith-based initiative from the outset, despite John DiIulio's best and most fervent efforts, they did serve their purpose, for they helped stigmatize the initiative, polarize supporters and critics, and in the process, the poor, who could have benefited from access to more effective programs, and they were punished by their so-called friends. Here's what history will show, I think, about the Bush faith-based initiative. First, that it was indeed a presidential priority, and second, that it succeeded against all odds. Presidential priority. It was at the heart of President Bush's compassionate conservatism, and it was a priority of his presidency. The faith-based initiative was mentioned in each of his first five State of the Union speeches, with new pilot programs announced each year, and then later funded by Congress in a bipartisan fashion. He attempted to get other legislation passed in Congress, and he succeeded after great effort with some. He devoted his schedule, presidential events each year, to this initiative and spoke at several White House faith-based conferences throughout America, conferences that he had started to help groups learn how to access government programs. And there's no disputing President Bush's commitment. You measure the seriousness of a president about a presidential initiative by these factors. And while 9/11 and two wars changed the trajectory of his presidency, he never wavered in his support of the faith-based initiative. I was with him at his home yesterday. We talked about the faith-based initiative. He believes in it as much now as he did when he was running for office. It was I think one of the proud contributions he made as U.S. President, and his library prominently features it near the entrance as part of his legacy. And now to the accomplishments of the faith-based initiative, and I will cite five that I'm most proud of. First, the President fought discrimination and defended the right of faith-based groups to be in the public square. The Seattle Hebrew Academy got its grant, Old North Church got its Save America's Treasure grant, the local HUD agency stopped harassing the Salvation Army in Janesville, Wisconsin, and the executive order went unchallenged. Second, the President promoted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the hiring rights of religious employers, and signed into law the TANF program, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, and the charitable choice legislation when it was reauthorized in 2005. I was there at the signing ceremony in the East Room, and the President touted those rights, the fundamental rights of groups to hire on a religious basis that had been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously in 1972. Third, the President succeeded in getting parts of the so-called CARE Act passed, which provided tax incentives for charitable giving. And this, too, lasted for years until the current administration let it lapse. Four, the President reached out in bipartisan fashion to Democrats. I recall my second week in the job, an Oval Office meeting with President Hillary Clinton. Oops. When Senator Hillary Clinton and other Democrats were there in the Oval Office talking about the faith-based initiative, he reached out to governors at each National Governors Association briefing, urging them to open a faith-based office. And you know who did? Mostly Democratic governors. And in fact, there were 35 offices open by the time I left, and they primarily were Democratic governors. I held events with U.S. senators that were Democrats. Bill Nelson of Florida. I had a press event with Senator Tom Daschle, the leader. We tried to do what we could to reach out on a bipartisan basis. And while sometimes these efforts were futile, I share John's view that bipartisanship should be at the core of the future of the faith-based initiative. And then finally, all of George Bush's signature programs that he announced in the State of the Union addresses were funded by Congress and helped countless Americans. First, the Compassion Capital Fund. Second, a program for the mentoring of the children of prisoners. Third, the Access to Treatment and Recovery program that he started for drug addicts to use vouchers to be able to choose faith-based programs if they wished. Four, the Prisoner Reentry program. And then five, the Helping America's Youth program. And when you look at these accomplishments and you realize what was done against a pretty strong headwind, you have to realize, I think, that President Bush's efforts were not in vain. But the defense of faith-based organizations from discrimination has to continue. And unfortunately, today we see government punishing faith-based organizations like my little university, Ave Maria University, a tiny school in Southwest Florida, 10 years old, that's seeking to maintain its sincerely held religious beliefs and has been forced to file a lawsuit against the huge United States Department of Health and Human Services. And unfortunately, when you see these HHS regulations that so narrowly define what it means to be a religious organization in this country, a faith-based organization, in a way without precedent by Democratic and Republican presidents alike, you realize that it's never safe for faith-based organizations in the public square. I'll be interested in hearing from my colleagues on why the voices of Cardinals, Evangelicals, Mennonites, the Little Sisters of the Poor, for crying out loud, all these voices have been ignored, and why there are scores of lawsuits today challenging this. I'll close my remarks by saying that the highlight for me was the opportunity to tour the country and see the many great faith-based organizations and community groups at work, volunteering their time, expressing their compassion, their love, answering the fundamental question, who is my neighbor? Am I my brother's keeper or my sister's keeper? The great courage of these men and women. I remember being at Beit Shuvah, a drug treatment program in Pasadena built around the Torah with a tremendously great success rate. The Dream Center in St. Louis, where I met a little 12-year-old boy, Lonel, who was not able to read a word at that point in his life, but after a year of mentoring, was able to read at the 4th grade level. So many programs. I remember here in Dallas, a homeless shelter run by a woman, I don't remember her name, I thought it was something like Butch. But there was a woman here running this incredible homeless program, so effective, transformative. So I have a debt of gratitude for those memories. And then I'll leave you with my biggest laugh during my time as faith-based director at the White House. Right after a State of the Union address, the President asked me to organize a meeting of all of our critics, the people who couldn't stand the faith-based initiative. He said, get them together, hear what their concerns are, see if you can find some common ground. So I asked my assistant, Catherine Ryan, to organize a meeting in my office. And I gave her the list: the Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, the ACLU, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, American University Women, a lot of the so-called liberal groups in America, all of whom couldn't stand the Bush faith-based initiative. It was hard to find a day everybody could meet. She found a Wednesday in February in which they could come to the White House and meet with me. It turned out that that Wednesday happened to be Ash Wednesday. I went that morning, as is my custom, to Mass. And at Mass on Ash Wednesday, the priest gives you ashes. When a bald person comes before a priest, what they see here is a blank canvas. And the artist comes out in them. And so this priest on this morning decided to do a life-size reenactment and with Mary and Joseph. And so I came back from Mass to the office, to the meeting. They're all assembled. I walked in with a big black cross on my forehead. They thought I was making a statement. But I do think at the end of the day, what unites us and what unites... I met Joshua tonight for the first time, and I knew Melissa from her work at Pew. What I think does unite us is a desire to make this country more strong from within and to live up to our highest ideals in serving those in need. Thank you. God bless you.
Well, good evening. I would like to add my word of thanks to Jeffrey and Brian for hosting us, and even more so for your commitment to presidential history. You may be interested to know that the esteemed White House historian Bradley Patterson, who's written the authoritative accounts on White House history, has identified this office as one of the most important innovations in the modern era. So I wish you well in your task. And on that note, I recognize Alan Lowe and National Archives and Records Administration, the Bush Center staff.